So, in this chapter on fundamental rights, I would like to speak specifically about the difference between various rights which we generally hear. For example, natural rights, civil rights, civil liberties, then human rights, fundamental rights. So, the heading is types of rights, say natural rights, human rights, then civil rights, etc. Then of course fundamental rights. Okay. Now, if you look that way, natural rights. Now, let us first talk about the natural by virtue of nature, by virtue of our birth. Okay. So, that is what we are talking in terms of natural right, by virtue of birth. In fact, natural rights, these are also universal rights. They are enjoyed by every individual by virtue of birth as a human being, by virtue of our life, natural right. So, the central to the concept of natural right, is the view that every human being enjoys a complete and exclusive domain. Every human being enjoys a complete and exclusive domain over his or her mental and bodily facilities, exclusive domain over his or her mental and bodily facilities. Mental and bodily facilities and the fruits in the form of personal property. See, that means basically human rights are more in our society as a human being, as a social animal. But when it comes to natural right, the biological, the as a physical or as a biological entity, our mental and bodily complete and exclusive domain over his or her mental and bodily facilities and the fruits thereon in the form of personal property, in the form of personal property. So, the natural rights are more about the persona, the again, and is a view that every human being enjoys a complete and exclusive dominion over his or her mental and bodily facility, dominion. Okay, I mean, I think I made wrongly, I spoiled dominion over his or her mental and bodily facility. So, it is more that physical entity. So, a natural right entails a conception of private ownership. It entails a conception of private ownership. Entails a conception of private ownership grounded on the subjective status of individual human being. See, on that conception of private ownership of individual human being. I mean, the person and his body is his private, I mean, he is a private ownership. So, the rights arising from such human subjectivity are both inalienable and prescriptible, or rather inalienable, in the sense that any attempt to renounce or extinguish this natural right will automatically result in the cessation or the stoppage of one's personhood. Meaning, it's basically, if natural rights are not there, then as a person, I am as a person, my rights are going to be violated. See, for example, I mean, simple example, like right to clothing is a inalienable and I will say imperceptible right, which cannot be violated, because it is a natural right. See, right to maybe even right to shelter, right to clothing. So, these are considered to be natural rights. If that is violated, it will lead to cessation of one's personhood, lead to cessation of one's personhood. Meaning, it is a violation of everything. And even slavery, for example, slavery is a violation of natural right. Natural right, it says that to maybe even right to shelter, right to clothing. So, these are considered to be natural rights. If that is violated, it will lead to cessation of one's personhood, lead to cessation of one's personhood, meaning it is a violation of everything. And even slavery, for example, slavery is a violation of natural right. Natural right, it says that slavery is violates it leads to natural inequalities of intellect or physique. Slavery leads to natural inequalities. Slavery leads to natural inequalities of intellect or physique. Natural inequalities of intellect or physique. So, basically by virtue of birth, by virtue of our life, by virtue of our biology, our body, our mind, that is natural rights. So, I said slavery is a violation of natural rights. Right to shelter, right to clothing, good examples of natural rights we can say. And all these natural rights are also part of human rights. So, in fact, if you, in Venn diagram, if you show, I mean, you might have heard about Venn diagram in school and all, we did it. I will say larger set is the human rights. As we say everything comes under the human rights. So, within human rights, there are a certain set of rights, we can call it as natural rights. By virtue of birth, by virtue of life, by virtue of our biology and the body and mind. Then there are something called fundamental rights. See, fundamental rights are those human rights which are enshrined in the constitution of the country. Fundamental rights are those human rights which are enlisted in the constitution of India. In the constitution of India. See, we are talking about fundamental rights in India. These are those human rights. See, all fundamental rights are human rights. So, for your understanding, let me just remind you, all fundamental rights are human rights. All natural rights are human rights. So, how will you draw that fundamental right within this? So, this is fundamental right. So, fundamental rights are also a subset of human rights. Natural rights, see, human rights are the larger set. By virtue of human being, our natural rights, our social rights, everything will come in to live. See, man is a biocultural animal. It's a biological animal as well as a cultural animal, or man is a social animal, but culture and society. So, human rights will talk about as a full in the, see, human rights helps in developing a person's full cultural, intellectual, moral, spiritual status to develop everything, including his natural by virtue of birth, his the physique, his mind, then the social status, everything will come under the human rights. But natural rights only by virtue of body and mind, we can say by virtue of birth. So, fundamental rights are a subset of human rights, natural rights are a subset of human rights. So, that is how those who can understand this Venn diagram, it is very easy. Those who cannot, please understand all fundamental rights are human rights, all natural rights with respect to human beings are human rights, and but all human rights are not fundamental rights. All human rights are not fundamental rights, because some of these fundamental rights or some of these human rights are not mentioned as fundamental rights. So, that is how we classify. So, by virtue of human being, and human rights are defined very easily. I mean, the most acceptable definition is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by UN in 1948. Human rights are defined and declared as Universal Declaration of Human Rights by UN in 1948. Now, so natural rights are universal, human rights are universal, but fundamental rights are specific to a particular country. Anyway, so that is how the definition, and then let me talk about the civil rights. Now, this is a very, you know, a term which is extensively used in US and all, civil rights. Civil rights movement in USA. So, in fact, these are again enjoyed by citizens of a country, and civil rights can vary from, like fundamental rights can vary from country to country, civil rights also can vary from country to country. But generally, the rights you know, which are designed to protect individuals from unfair treatment. Civil rights, if you look at the general definition, the rights which are designed to protect individuals from unfair treatment. To protect individuals from unfair treatment, or they are the rights of individual to receive equal treatment. We can say civil rights are rights of individuals to receive equal treatment. To receive equal treatment, okay, to prevent you know, free from unfair treatment. Say equal treatment in education, say civil rights, equal treatment in what? In education, in healthcare, in employment, in housing, there should not be any mistreatment or differential treatment, or suppose, you know, you go and ask for a rented house, if you are not given house only because you belong to a particular community or a caste, you know, it's a violation of the civil rights. Public accommodation, like, you know, if you go to a hotel and if you are not given room only because you are a colored person, say in US and all, it is a big problem. It was a problem against the African Americans in US. Okay, so they are, you know, that is how the concept of civil rights have come. Historically, as I said, civil rights movement referred to the efforts towards achieving equality for the African Americans in all facets of society. And but today, civil rights are also being used to describe the advancement of equality to all people, regardless of race, sex, caste, age, disability, everything will come into picture, religion. So that, you know, the right, so basically rights of individual to receive equal treatment, or right to protect individuals from unfair treatment, that is civil rights movements. Martin Luther King, the junior and all, you know, they fought for civil rights of the African Americans. So that is a civil rights movement in it. Then civil liberties. So civil rights versus civil liberties, another small heading, civil rights versus civil liberties. See, civil liberties are more like our fundamental rights, the liberty, the freedom, Article 19, Article 20. But civil rights, the right to have or the freedom from, or the right to have equal treatment or freedom from unfair treatment. So civil rights is the concept of civil rights, and the basic right to be free from unequal treatment based on certain protected character, based on race, based on religion, based on color, disability, etc. That is civil rights, we have already seen. But civil liberty are more broad-based rights and freedom. Civil liberties, broad-based rights and freedom. And they are guaranteed by the Constitution. Guaranteed by, like in Article 19, the right to freedom of speech and expression in India is a civil liberty. Okay, so based on broad-based rights and freedom enshrined in the Constitution, enshrined in the federal Constitution, like our fundamental rights. Okay, and so these are broad: right to vote, right to freedom of speech, right to life, right to privacy. All these things can come under the civil liberty, like right to privacy. Example, right to freedom of speech and expression, freedom of speech and expression. So, these are examples of civil liberties. So, then there is something called statutory right. See, statutory right means a right by virtue of a law, like an ordinary law, Right to Information Act. See, statute, RTI is a statutory right, okay, rights provided by law, like best example is RTI Act, or many other rights we are given as a part of an ordinary law. If a right is prescribed as an ordinary law, minority rights, sometimes some of the minority rights are not mentioned in the constitution, but it is as an act of the parliament. Okay. So, like that, so whenever it is made, a right is passed by an act of the parliament, by a statute provided by law, is statutory law. Constitutional right, what is written in the constitution? Fundamental rights, constitutional rights. Best example of constitutional rights are fundamental rights. So, we have natural rights by virtue of birth, by virtue of biology, by virtue of your body and mind. Say, I said right to clothing, right against slavery are natural rights. Human rights by virtue of you as a human being, not just by life. See, you have an animal life. See, if you don't have human rights, you have only natural right and animal life. But human beings are not only alive, we are also social animals. We are not just biological animals, we are also social animals. By virtue of our culture and society, we have much more broader rights. Right to self-determination, okay, right to education. So, many things are there as part of the human rights. So, human rights is the broadest of all. That is why I drew a Venn diagram, and it is shown that human rights are the broadest. All rights are included in the human rights. The natural rights are also part of it by virtue of our birth, by body and mind. Then fundamental rights, those human rights which are mentioned in the constitution, they are fundamental rights. So, that is how we can distinguish between natural rights, human rights, fundamental rights, then civil rights, the right not to be discriminated, that is a big thing. Okay, the civil rights movement in US especially, to protect individuals from unfair treatment. They are the right of individual to receive equal treatment. So, there is civil rights. But civil liberty is a broad term, like our fundamental right to freedom in our constitution, within the fundamental rights, like Article 19, Article 20, all part of civil liberties. So, that is how the difference. Please make the difference very important for our exam point of view.